Now in BBC Two Scotland, coverage of the final day's debates at the Scottish Liberal Democrats Conference, live from Inverness.
Hello and welcome to the final day of the Scottish Liberal Democrat Conference here in Inverness. It's been an uneven weekend for the party, with difficulties over gender balance and confusion over their tax policy. But today they'll be debating the future of the Scottish Parliament, the merits of which they're all agreed on. Lord Steele, the former Liberal leader, will be speaking in this debate, and he may or may not end speculation about whether he intends to stand for the Scottish Parliament. So without further ado, let's go into the conference hall now and my colleague David Porter.
Thank you, Ian. The debate on the Scottish Parliament will be getting underway very shortly. At the moment, delegates are just concluding a discussion on land use in Scotland. We've heard calls for the abolition of the Common Agricultural Policy, together with proposals for more public access to land throughout the country. We'll be hearing that debate on the Scottish Parliament in a few minutes, as I say, but the debate on land use has just come to an end. We've just heard a speech by the convener-elect of the party, Stephen Gallagher, calling for support for the motion.
I propose to take votes firstly for the amendments and then for the motion as a whole. So if we can go first to Amendment 2. Those in favour, please show. And those against? That's unanimously, almost unanimously carried. Amendment 1. Those in favour, please show. And those against? That's almost unanimously carried as well. And for the motion as a whole, those in favour, please show. And those against? Right, we've cracked it.
So overwhelming support there for the motion.
I've got an interesting clutch of announcements here, which I'd like to share with you. Donald Gorey has told me that there's to be a secret meeting, secret in as much as nobody's been told about it yet, on land value taxation in the boardroom at 1:30, and literature is available there. The speakers will be Andrew Duffield and Donald Gorey, so it will no longer be a secret. There's a less secret meeting at 1 o'clock in the upper foyer of the Eden Court, and that's a meeting to discuss the setting up of an organisation to promote Liberal Democrat women in Scotland, a theme which has run and run this conference. Hilary Campbell will be chairing it as the Vice President of the Women Liberal Democrats. And yet another announcement about the Gladstone 100 dinner with Roy Jenkins, David Steele and Bernard Ponsonby. Tickets are £20 and available from Norman Fraser or Robert Brown. Thank you. I now hand over the chair to Callum Irvine.
Well, there are a couple of housekeeping chores there about the conference. This, the final day of the conference, will be moving very shortly on to the debate on the Scottish Parliament, where there's going to be great interest in the comments that Lord Steele will be speaking. He may or may not end speculation about whether he intends to stand for the Scottish Parliament.
Yes, David, I think that's right. I would expect, actually, that David Steele will end the confusion. There was some concern of the fact that he wasn't able to be selected for a constituency seat. I would expect that he'll be saying that he's putting his name forward for the South of Scotland list for the party, and the expectation, of course, is that he will top that list, despite the efforts to give women a prominent place.
Of course, if David Steele was elected, it would be something of a bit of a dynasty, perhaps, for the Steele family in the new Scottish Parliament, couldn't it?
They're certainly attempting that, but Lord Steele, of course, played a leading role in the convention which drafted the scheme which laid down the ground rules for the government's plans.
Well, let's hear a little bit more of that debate now on the Scottish Parliament.
Who would have thought several years ago, when the Constitutional Convention started out on its weary path, that under a Labour government with a huge majority at Westminster, they would be introducing a bill for a Scottish Parliament with a proportional voting system. That system is the key feature of this bill. It will help break up the adversarial political system, which people find so repellent. It will ensure that wherever you are, however you vote, that vote will count. It will herald the end of one-party politics in Scotland and may be the beginning of the end of two-party politics in Britain. Now, I know it's not perfect, we all know that, but it is a start, and I think we should be eternally grateful to those on the Constitutional Convention who have battled so hard on our behalf, to Jim Wallace, to Marilyn, to Donald Gorrie, and especially Andy Miles. But it isn't all good news. There are still many things in the bill that show tendencies of centralism and illiberalism, particularly the list of so-called reserved matters. Some of these are perfectly sensible, such as foreign affairs, defence and monetary policy. But why, for example, does the government not trust the people of Scotland to deal with energy policy? We, as Liberal Democrats, were debating the very subject of nuclear power yesterday morning. And why is Scotland's Parliament not dealing with Scotland's broadcasting? And although there's been an amendment to the bill with regard to railways, why can't we control our own railway system? These are not issues which demand uniformity across the United Kingdom. They are subjects which should be decentralised and devolved to the decision-making body which is closest to the people. And I think at this point it's important to emphasise that this bill is not the end of the story as far as Liberal Democrats are concerned for constitutional reform in the United Kingdom. We remain wholly committed to achieving the system which will guarantee fair and stable government for all of Britain's nations and regions, a fully federal United Kingdom. And then there is the question of venue. And before we ourselves get into any debate on this, I should declare an interest as a resident of Edinburgh. But it's also worth noting that this motion is proposed by two different local parties from two different sides of Scotland. In case we all forget, there are other places in Scotland than Edinburgh and Glasgow. Stirling, Falkirk, Perth or even Pitlochry have all greater claims to being at the centre of Scotland than the Royal Mile does or Charing Cross. But if it had to be in Edinburgh, then the old Royal High School is an astonishingly fitting site for a Parliament building. It is architecturally unparalleled for such a purpose in the whole of Scotland, and Calton Hill is just as imposing a site as you could think of. It's but a hop, skip and a jump from the largest mainline railway station in Scotland. With over 90% of public support in or outside Edinburgh, it was clearly the people's choice, a factor that couldn't have escaped even the most right-wing of a new Labour focus group. So what did Donald Dewar give us his reasons for this astonishing decision to organise a cock-up over an old brewery? Well, none, actually. But what our friends in the press tell us is that Donald wouldn't stand for Calton Hill because it was a nationalist shibboleth, whatever that means. It was also one in the eye for the Edinburgh establishment. When Donald Dewar considers the 90% public support to be an establishment viewpoint, we can conclusively see that democratic socialism has been turned on its head. But enough of this consideration, and back instead to the depressing reality of Labour politics. At one pointless mess, then we had a truly dangerous one, over where the Parliament would sit initially. A few weeks ago, the Scottish Office spin doctors briefed the media that the Strathclyde Regional Council headquarters in Glasgow was now the preferred site for the Parliament's temporary home. The rights and wrongs of such a move aside, the briefing had two effects. The first was to cause the City of Edinburgh to substantially revise its bid based on the General Assembly Hall on the Mound, but the second was to open up a bitter and unnecessary war between the country's two greatest cities. And the purpose of this feud in the eyes of the Scottish Office? To take Labour's difficulties over Sean Connery's missing knighthood off the front pages of the newspapers for one day. When a Secretary of State for Scotland, who represents a Glasgow constituency, treats that proud and great city as a mere diversionary tactic in a public relations squabble, then he demeans the office of Secretary of State itself. With the delusion of invincibility that Labour ministers now display, Donald Dewar clearly thinks that he is solely and personally responsible for delivering the Scottish Parliament. Yet it was the votes of Scottish people which made that inevitable, culminating in the stunning referendum result, which in itself came about from many yes, yes campaigns around the country, which many people in this hall campaigned tirelessly in. And as for consultation, the great difficulty in persuading the constitutional steering group that's been set up that they have been fully consulted is that so much of the consultation has been retrospective. Who's got the mic? Switch.
Slight confusion.
You hear me at the back?
I think they seem to think that the microphones aren't perhaps working. They're just actually doing a little bit
The great difficulty.
Oh, they've managed to make them work again.
The great difficulty in persuading the Constitutional Steering Group that they have been fully consulted is that so much of the consultation has been retrospective. Donald thinks it's his own personal responsibility to make all the important decisions about the Parliament and let everyone else know after the press conference. Donald's idea of wide and varied consultation is to walk down the corridor of St Andrew's House and ask Henry McLeish what he thinks. I would like to remind Donald Dewar of one simple point. This is Scotland's Parliament. This motion says it, the final report of the Constitutional Convention said it, the White Paper even said it. It's Scotland's Parliament, not Donald's Parliament. It is our job as Scottish Liberal Democrats to see that this golden opportunity for true democracy is not wasted. We must ensure that the Parliament is open, honest, accessible and accountable. The way it's starting life under Labour, though, looks closed, secretive and against a large tide of public opinion on several important issues. We cannot let Labour get away with it. Please support the motion.
The debate on the Scottish Parliament being opened by Derek Young of East Dunbartonshire and Edinburgh Central. He criticised the government for not putting the Parliament at the Royal Old High School in Carlton Hill. Lord Steele of Akewood there, as we can see on our screens now, he'll be speaking in the debate a little bit later on. In fact, he'll be speaking
Mr. Chairman,
very, very shortly.
fellow Liberal Democrats, the Scottish Parliament that we in this party and their colleagues in the Scottish Constitutional Convention have fought for is now almost a reality. The Scotland Bill is presently going through Parliament, and this will create a new legislature for Scotland for the first time in almost 300 years. Understandably, it would be easy to be carried away in the euphoria of that unquestionable fact and the afterglow of the referendum result last September. But it's also incumbent upon us, especially in this party, to stop for a moment to take stock about the kind of Parliament we want for Scotland. For if we fail at this time to create the correct conditions for the Parliament to flourish, to become an enduring institution in Scottish political life, then, in my view, the whole enterprise could founder in its early years. We must not forget that the Parliament which we are now creating is not universally welcomed. The Tories are, even now, only grudgingly accepting the overwhelming result in the referendum. Some businesses are still very suspicious about the whole project. So it's incumbent upon us who support the establishment of a strong, lasting Parliament, which will be a monument to all that's best in Scottish political life, to speak up now, because we won't get another chance. But as Derek Young's already alluded to in his opening speech, the gloss is already coming off the referendum consensus, and Labour seem determined to plough their own furrow on the Scotland Bill. Take the Blairite spin doctors at the Labour conference who were suggesting that a parish council is all we deserve and a parish council is all we're going to get. Colleagues, I fundamentally disagree with that patronising assertion, and we must make sure that it's not a parish council we get, but a powerhouse Parliament as laid down in the Scottish Constitutional Convention document. But there are a number of problems in the bill that seem to suggest that if we're not going to get a parish council, then at least what we're going to get is a Parliament which is largely subordinated to Westminster. And the main reason for this lies buried in the detail of the bill. In Clause 81 and Schedule 1 of the bill. Now these clauses are pretty dry if you're not a lawyer, but what it basically means is that we will be reducing the number of Westminster constituencies at the next Boundary Commission review. And the protection that Scotland has had up till now of 71 seats or thereby is removed. But more importantly, tucked away in the schedule is the indication that the proportion of additional members should be in proportion to the Westminster seats. And the whole project is based on the coterminous Westminster seats and Scottish Parliament seats. Now, you may be wondering, what does this all mean really at the end of the day? But the problem would be in the second term of a Scottish Parliament, which is presently made up of 129 members, if the Westminster seats are reduced, as is presently suggested, from about 72 to about 60, and as a result, proportionally, the number of additional member seats are falling as well, you could see a Parliament reduced from about 129 to about 102. Now, the problem is that the Parliament is really largely dependent on the committee system to operate proper scrutiny and proper accountability of the executive. And you only have to look at the way that there are a number of MPs in the payroll at Westminster, because they're either in the cabinet, they're junior ministers, or they're parliamentary private secretaries. That system's going to obtain in Holyrood. So if you have a small independent group of backbench MPs sitting on committees, and it's only 102, then I think it's not going to be sufficient to allow proper scrutiny. And that's where the problem lies. It shouldn't be like this. We can have a separate Scottish Parliamentary Boundary Commission, because in local government we have a separate Boundary Commission. So why not a separate Scottish Parliamentary Boundary Commission? It's dead easy. But because Westminster wants to subordinate the new Parliament, we're not getting it. So my heartfelt plea to this conference is, let Scotland's Parliament stand alone. Don't let's make the Holyrood Parliament an adjunct of Westminster. The inexorable logic of the provisions in the Scotland Bill is to allow this to happen. So I would move that we support this motion and we make sure that we protect the Parliament in its early years so that it becomes a powerful Parliament rather than a parish council. Beg to move.
Councillor John Morrison there from East Dunbartonshire, calling for the new Scotland Parliament to have more powers.
Could I call on Councillor Sue Tritton, and could Keith Rathen stand by, please?
The next speaker will be Councillor Sue Tritton from Edinburgh South.
Good morning, Conference. I'm going to continue at where John Morrison left off, because the points I want to make about the number of MSPs. And if I remember correctly, this conference said that reducing the number from 145 to 129 was not negotiable. And there is now a suggestion that if we follow the redesignation of the number of the representation to Westminster, we could drop down to about 100. It seems to me that this is an absolutely perfect argument for STV in multi-member constituencies, because if you have a constituency that consists of a population of, say, 300,000, it could easily send 3 MPs to Westminster, but 4 or 5 to Edinburgh. And you don't have to go through the stupid negotiation of boundary changes or having people belonging to different constituencies for different representation. In my own ward in Edinburgh, I got elected in 95 on a boundary change from when I had stood in 92. There is going to be another boundary change, probably, we're not sure, but probably before next year's election. We're not sure what the boundary change will be accepted. We're not sure when it's going to be. Is this the way to get the population feeling represented by anybody. I may or may not be a good councillor. That's not the point. You can't get the local people to feel attached to any area if you're continually changing them. It could even be that people are voting in council elections in one ward, Scottish Parliament elections in another, still having a Westminster representation from a third, and a month later we're going to have a European election where it's a Scotland-wide thing. Let's push for STV, push for multi-member constituencies. It's quite right that the representation to Westminster must go. It's the only logical argument to follow, but let's make sure that the Scottish representation stays at the level that's essential. Thank you.
Councillor Sue Tritton there from Edinburgh South, calling for the single transferable vote to be used in the new Parliament and for there to be no fall in the number of seats in the new Scottish Parliament when there's a boundary review later on. Next speaker is Keith Raffin. Just a reminder that he's a former Conservative MP for North Wales who has joined the Liberal Democrats in the last couple of years and actually therefore, being a former Westminster MP, has experience of parliamentary life.
Parliament is going to be and what kind of building we supposedly need, rather than about how it's going to operate and what it's going to do. Those are the crucial things. The Scotland Bill sets out the framework for the Parliament. It'll be up to the members, the MSPs, in their first term, perhaps even in their first 2 terms, to flesh out that framework and to decide how it's going to operate. And that surely will determine the kind of Scottish Parliament building that we need. It will dictate the kind of facilities we need. Just to give you one example, is the Scottish Parliament going to be more committee or chamber orientated? I very much hope that we'll learn from the worst practice of Westminster and avoid it, and we'll actually adopt the best practice. I want to see the Select Committee procedure at Westminster integrated far more into the lawmaking procedure at Holyrood. I would like to see the Scottish Executive put bills in concept form, in green paper, to a Select Committee. It can take evidence, written and oral evidence, on that proposed bill, perhaps for a year before the bill actually comes to the Chamber itself. That'll avoid the appalling situation that we have at Westminster at the moment, where the government rushes through badly drafted bills with loads of government amendments. And it will also dictate the kind of building we need. If it's going to be more committee-orientated than chamber-orientated, that'll determine the kind of facilities, the number of rooms you need, and the actual layout of the building. We're talking about an evolving institution, one that's going to develop over time, not one set in tablets of Aberdeen granite. And we therefore be far more sensible to put off this whole business of designing and building a new building in advance of the Parliament and leave it to the members of Parliament, cross-party discussion, exactly as happens at Westminster. How much more credit the Secretary of State would have got if he had said, after cross-party consultation, we are going to catch up with the backlog in school building maintenance before we build a Scottish Parliament building. That would have been unusual for politicians, wouldn't it? Let's house Scottish pupils before we house Scotland's politicians. The country's littered with buildings, a lot of them empty, from the reorganisation of local government before last. It surely is that the priority should be the people, not the politicians. All he succeeded in doing so far is setting Glasgow against Edinburgh and confirming the worst fears of those who have reservations about the Scottish Parliament in the first place. I know, my parents are among them, and they say to me constantly, "We told you so, it's going to cost us a fortune and we're going to have to pay." The Australian Parliament for 60 years managed to exist perfectly comfortably in what they called a provisional, in other words, a temporary building. Now that may be a bit excessive, but it's quite possible for the Scottish Parliament to go into temporary facilities for 4 to 10 years, decide exactly what kind of building they need. As Derek says, it's not Donald's Parliament, it's not Labour's Parliament, it's Scotland's Parliament. It's never too late, Secretary of State. I know Labour believes in the power of repetition, so just 3 words: consultation, consultation, consultation.
The former Conservative MP, Keith Ratner, who's now a member of the Liberal Democrats, calling for the government and Donald Dewar in particular to consult more about Scotland's Parliament. Well, coming up to the rostrum now is Lord Steele of Akewood, and he's expected to end speculation about whether he intends to stand for the Parliament or not.
Conference, I want just to say two things in broad support of this motion today. First is that I entirely agree with Jim Wallace that the last thing the Scottish Parliament should be doing when it gets going is reopening the constitutional debate, as the SNP seem to wish. I don't think the public of Scotland expect us to continue that discussion indefinitely. But having said that, I believe that the Scottish Parliament should flex its muscles within the framework that we have already agreed. The Parliament is going to start with no traditions, therefore let it start with some ideals. It's going to start in an atmosphere talking about the glories and history of Scotland, and that's fine. But yet our major cities contain some of the grimiest and dampest, crime and drug-ridden, poverty-gripped housing estates in Europe. And the Parliament must concentrate on these issues and provide a ray of hope to those in our country who've given up hope. And that means looking at new and imaginative ways of raising revenues beyond our much over-debated income tax. Let me give you a minor example. A few years ago, the Westminster Parliament bottled out of introducing a dog registration scheme. And yet the problems of uncontrolled dogs and irresponsible dog ownership in both urban and rural areas could be overcome and revenue raised by such a scheme. And again, although there is no formal responsibility for the Scottish Parliament to deal in international affairs, I can tell you from my own discussions with ministers in Scandinavian governments and in Canada that our northern neighbours are looking forward to a re-emergence of a real Scottish political identity. And both there and throughout the Commonwealth, where the Scottish tag is especially valued, Scottish ministers and parliamentarians can play a vital role in generating trade and therefore employment for our people. So let the Parliament be bold and flex its muscles on policy making both internally and externally. The second point I want to make is just this. As a party, ours has been a unique heritage and a unique contribution to this great adventure. Let us remind people that it was Mr. Gladstone in the middle of the last century who talked about home rule all round. Let us remind people that it was the Liberal MP for Ross and Cromarty who in 1914 introduced the Scottish Home Rule Bill that went through all its stages in the Commons and was only frustrated by the outbreak of the First World War, and which incidentally introduced the radical concept of votes for women at the same time. Let us remind people that it was the young Joe Grimmond in his maiden speech in 1950 in the House who called for a Scottish Parliament, that it was John M. Bannerman, Ray Mickey's father, who here in Inverness rocked the Tory government by coming within 1,000 votes of winning this seat. These were at times when the Labour Party had forgotten its home rule traditions and the SNP was powerless and irrelevant. It was this party that kept hope alive. And in the 1960s, during the period of Labour Party power and indifference towards Scotland, it was Liberal MPs like Russell Johnson and George Mackey and James Davidson who pressed the home rule case. And let's remind people that when the SNP was founded in 1934, they called for, and I quote, a parliament which shall be the final authority on all Scottish affairs, not for separation, not for global independence, but the final authority on all Scottish affairs. That's what we've got. And no thanks to them when they boycotted the Constitutional Convention and left it to our teams of people, led by Malcolm Bruce and Jim Wallace, to roll up their sleeves and produce the scheme which we have now got nearly into legislation. We have been the engine of this endeavour, and when others have faltered, we have been consistent. We have delivered, and we should shout that from the rooftops.
Lord Steele there of Akewood giving a speech where he describes the history of the Liberal Democrats' move towards the Scottish Parliament. No announcement there about what he intends to do. Perhaps he's going to keep us waiting a little bit longer. The next speaker is Councillor Ian Smith. He's indeed the prospective Scottish parliamentary candidate for North East Fife. And interestingly enough, the first candidate chosen by the Liberal Democrats to be a candidate for the Scottish Parliament.
It is understandable that as a party which has for 100 years fought to get a Scottish Parliament, that we want to get involved in the detailed discussion about how that Parliament will work. And of course we want a new type of Parliament for Scotland. I don't want to see the Scottish Parliament turning into a mini Westminster, a discredited cabinet style of government. I want the Scottish Parliament to be open and accessible to all the people of Scotland, not some ghettoised Parliament sitting in Holyrood. But our job over the next 13 months, let's be clear, is not to discuss how the furniture will be arranged or the decoration. Let's leave that to Derry Irvine. Our job over the next 13 months is to explain to the people of Scotland what the Scottish Parliament can actually do for them and what we as Scottish Liberal Democrats can offer them in the Scottish Parliament. And we have to be clear also, as Jim Wallace said yesterday, that we don't want to work with Labour in the Scottish Parliament. We don't want to work with the SNP in the Scottish Parliament. We want to work with Liberal Democrats in the Scottish Parliament, and let's make sure we get as many Liberal Democrats elected to that Parliament as possible. We must also make it clear to the people of Scotland that Scottish Liberal Democrat priorities for the Scottish Parliament and our policies for the Scottish Parliament will be decided here in Scotland by Scottish Liberal Democrats and not by anyone in London. Our priorities will be to invest in health. Our priorities will be to invest in education. And we will be brave enough to say to the Scottish people that if we have to raise tax to do so, we will do so from day one. Let there be no doubt about that. Delegates, fellow Liberal Democrats, support this motion, but let's get out there tomorrow and start campaigning for the Scottish Parliament and tell them what we will do for Scotland.
Speech there by Councillor Ian Smith, the first Liberal Democrat prospective candidate to be chosen for the Scottish Parliament.
I now call on Roy Thompson, and could Mike Rumbles stand by?
Next speaker, Roy Thompson.
Scottish Liberal Democrats. One of the questions which was one of the strongest, most debated during the referendum campaign was whether or not the Scottish Parliament would lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. We've always believed that it would do the opposite. But I am worried about the number and range of powers reserved to Westminster in the bill. I can see a considerable danger in this. Just let me tell you how extensive they are. In the schedule of reserved matters, matters which are going to be kept by Westminster, it's proposed, it starts with general reservations, things such as the Constitution, foreign affairs, public service, which means the civil service, defence and tourism. Fair enough, but then it goes on to specific reservations, and these are detailed under 11 different heads. Each of these heads has a number of sections. So section 1, which is financial and economic affairs, is 5 sections. So head 2 has home affairs, is 12, and so on. I've counted them, and there are a total of 70 different sections. In each section, there are several different items, so the whole adds up to, you get into the hundreds of specific reservations. Few of these are minor matters. They cover everything from nuclear energy to outer space. There are a great many which one has to wonder why we are not to be trusted with. Things such as hypnotism, the licensing of theatres, betting, gaming and lottery, and as the motion says, transport and abortion. Really emotive ones are ownership of oil and gas, broadcasting, consumer protection. I suppose in drafting the bill, it was thought easier to leave these very many things alone, but no doubt you can see the danger in this. It certainly gives ammunition to the SNP. Immediately, if all this happens, there will be howls of protest from them about the dominance of Westminster, and many Scots, all of us, will tend to feel somewhat insulted that we're not to be trusted with the regulation of so many facets of our own life. And where these matters as is mentioned in the motion, where these are matters which the Scottish Office already has under its jurisdiction, it's especially difficult to see any justification. Having achieved a parliament of our own, this marvellous effort which was led by David Steele and Jim, Malcolm and the others, the last thing we want to do is to see it end up in constant arguments with Westminster. No doubt there will be disagreements, but there is no need to provide ammunition to those who wish it not to succeed, whether they be from the Tory camp, who wish to see it fail, or the Nationalists, who wish to see it as a stepping stone. There will be an unholy alliance between those two camps. We must make our position quite clear to the Scottish people. Provisions of this bill need to be strengthened and more trust placed in the people and the Parliament of Scotland.
Roy Thompson from Aberdeen there. And the next speaker is Mike Rumbles.
PSBC for West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine. And could Hugh O'Donnell stand by, please?
And Mike Rumbles is another prospective candidate for the Scottish Parliament.
Well, I agree with everything that Roy said. I mean, we all know how responsive the Labour government has been at Westminster to almost any amendments in the Scotland Bill. They're not listening. And while, I agree with what he said, I really do think we should be trying to concentrate on one particular issue. And I'm going to, as much as I agree with the fact that the government must remove from the reserved list things like broadcasting, energy, transport, abortion, capital punishment, I do agree with that, but I really do think that they're really not going to listen to us. What I'd like to do is, don't want to dwell on that, and I'm not going to dwell on the decision-making skills of Donald Dewar referred to earlier between the spat between Edinburgh and Glasgow. What I want to focus on are the issues in the motion, going back to the last two paragraphs. I think this is where we can, I hope we can, make a real change in the attitude of the Labour government. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the issue of the proposed, in 10 years' time, the proposed reduction in the number of the members of the Scottish Parliament. I'm concerned particularly that if the number of the MSPs is linked to the reduction, quite rightly the reduction in the number of Westminster MPs, this would seriously undermine the abilities of the members of the Scottish Parliament to do the job properly. Now, I understand in the transitional period, the first 10 years, when at the moment all the responsibilities are at Westminster, and a lot of the responsibilities are going to move to Edinburgh, that there's got to be this link. But I really do believe there's absolutely no need to mirror the boundaries of Westminster constituencies forever, which is what I feel as we're going to go down this line in this bill. At best, it shows a serious lack of imagination, and at worst, it shows a serious lack of understanding of the need to scrutinise the work of the Scottish Executive and to hold it to account. Thank you.
That was Mike Rumbles. As we can see, applauding that is Donald Gorrie, one of the Westminster MPs. He would actually like to stand for the Scottish Parliament, but so far he hasn't received a nomination. He may try and get in on the list system with the proportional representation system a little bit later on when that's decided.
Conference, I'd like to consider the issue of broadcasting in relation to the Scottish Bill. Television, for most of us, for 96% of us, is the most popular source of news and entertainment in the country. According to the charter of the BBC, its neutrality is guaranteed, and as far as the commercial stations are concerned, their franchises guarantee that charter. So with that guarantee of neutrality, it's curious that Labour have decided to retain control of broadcasting. Ostensibly, the principle behind broadcasting in Britain is one of public service. It's one that provides universal access and a mixture of programming which reflects the cultural diversity of Scotland. Of course, that ignores the fact that you've got to hang out a window with a coat hanger to get Channel 5. And all of this, of course, is without government interference. But that's not strictly true, because at the end of the day, government appoints the boards of governors of the BBC, and it appoints ITC. That's interference no matter how you describe it. It sets the licence fee. It can revoke the licences of the commercial stations. If you've got the grip of an organisation by its balance sheet, that sounds like influence to me. But perhaps most of all, television in particular would have us believe it's a clear window into the world, that they offer an unimpaired view of issues, world events and other cultures. They're proud of that independence to act as our inquisitors, asking the questions of those in power that we don't have the opportunity to do. And it's important. But I question, how often does David Dimbleby in Question Time get to Inverness or Stornoway? I must have missed it. But perhaps most of all, and most significantly, broadcasters legitimise issues. They contextualise issues. They don't tell us necessarily what to think, but they certainly tell us what to think about. If it's on the telly, it must be important, except perhaps in the case of EastEnders. Much of the national coverage of our new Parliament has focused on the negative impact that it's going to have on the Union and on Britain. Very little about the positive development that it represents for Scotland and for Britain. That, I don't think, is the perspective of most Scots. It's certainly not my perspective. We do well to remember that broadcast news is a product, and like all products, it's manufactured. Producers produce, editors edit, reporters report. If that perspective is done as far away as we are from Broadcasting House, it's not going to be our perspective. The truth is that Scotland actually gets onto national coverage just before the dead donkey, if we're lucky. I'm realistic enough to realise that somebody's got to perform all these practical functions. But I object very strongly to the ultimate decisions being taken in London as far as such a powerful communication tool. In conclusion, I would commend this motion at the conference by suggesting that with new technology, within the life of the first Parliament, the first Scottish Parliament, there will be an opportunity for 500 television channels. It represents a tremendous opportunity for a voice of those who are as far removed from Edinburgh as we are in Edinburgh from London, to speak, to have a contribution made. I would much rather that control rested with an elected body in Scotland than be controlled from Millbank. Thank you.
Hugh O'Donnell there calling for the broadcasting powers to actually be operated by the Scottish Parliament. And those sentiments being applauded by Jim Wallace there. He is the only Westminster Liberal Democrat MP who has definitely said that he will be standing for a Scottish Parliament.
Thank you, Mr.
John Morrison
Chairman.
at the rostrum now.
I think the debate has reflected perhaps a degree of disquiet about the way the Scotland Bill is perhaps going at the moment. And I think it's right that that degree of disquiet is brought forward at this conference so that we can tell our MPs to go back to Westminster and not prepare for government, David, but to prepare to amend the bill. Basically, the Labour Party, I think, are frightened of what was described as the nationalist shibboleths. And I dare say I wouldn't have been able to pronounce that in the bar at 1 a.m. last night. But David Steele talked about the great traditions of this party seeking home rule. And it's not a debate about the furniture and where it's going to sit. It's a debate as to how it's going to affect the lives of the people of Scotland. And that's essentially what the debate has brought out. There has been concern shown, really, about the number of reserved powers. Why do we need to reserve all these powers to Westminster? The Parliament which is going to be set up in Holyrood should be mature enough to decide on a number of issues and a whole range of issues. And we shouldn't be reserving powers to Westminster. We should be giving it a power of general competence to deal with matters which arise in Scotland and affect the people of Scotland. For any institution to evolve, as was brought out in the debate, it needs to be properly planted, and the foundations need to be properly put into the ground. So it's not just about buildings, but the foundations of the institution will determine how that institution performs. And there is a degree of disquiet about the reduction of the numbers of MPs, causing that evolution perhaps not to make the Parliament as effective as it might be in the early years. So really, what I should be urging all of you to do is to go back and to continue to fight for the Parliament, continue to campaign for the Parliament, but for our members of Parliament to go back to Westminster and make sure that the proper amendments are made and put forward and debated to ensure that the Parliament, when it starts off, is strong and able to meet the needs and aspirations of the Scottish people in the new millennium. I beg to move.
Councillor John Morrison there from Eastern Bartonshire, actually summing up the debate. His argument was very much that the Scottish Parliament ought to have more powers and that the Liberal Democrats ought to be pressing for that.
The vote now, so if you get your cards ready, could I see all those in favour of the motion, please? And all those against? That is unanimously carried. Thank you very much.
Well, as expected, that vote was universally and almost unanimously carried. I'm joined in the commentary position by my colleague, my political editor, Brian Taylor. Brian, some degree of anger, I think, that perhaps Labour is giving us a Scottish Parliament that perhaps has not got the powers that the Liberal Democrats would want.
Yes, indeed, John. I mean, let's look through some of the issues that there are in the motion. First of all, they condemn the nature of the decision to make Holyrood the permanent site, and they're backing Calton Hill. Now, let's be clear about this. This is perhaps the view of the conference, but they're not seriously going to push that one. The second one, removing from the list of powers reserved to Westminster. They say they want to reduce those areas that stay at Westminster. Now, that is a serious Liberal Democrat concern. You heard broadcasting being particularly mentioned there, but energy and transport are also issues. But again, reading between the lines, what I think they're saying is that ultimately they would expect these powers to be devolved in further developments. The one that really catches them, the one that I've been talking to delegates about here, and there's David Steele, despite not making the announcement from the conference
rostrum. Yes, he sort of almost marched us up to the top of the hill a little bit, didn't he? And then sort of didn't give us what we thought we were going to get.
But I understand he is indeed suggesting that he will attempt to stand for the South of Scotland list. His wife Judy sitting beside him there. Now, I think the one that really concerns the party is the third element of this motion, which is the suggestion that following a review at Westminster, it's rather complicated this, but Westminster, currently 72 Scottish MPs, the suggestion is that should be reduced to around about 60, maybe 58, and it's then suggested that as a concomitant to that, the number of members of the Scottish Parliament would have to be reduced to keep the boundaries the same shape. Now, the Liberal Democrats think that's outrageous, and again, talking to them privately, they don't think it'll stick. They think once the Parliament gets set up with 129 MPs, it'll jolly well want to hang on to 129 MPs, although one of them might not be Donald Gorrie. We see there he's been not been selected by his party for West Edinburgh and has indicated that he won't continue at Westminster.
Indeed, the fact that Donald Gorrie hasn't yet been selected, you would have expected him perhaps to, shows that nothing is actually certain with this Scottish Parliament.
No, and also Donald Gorrie's fate, I think, explains why so few MPs from Westminster have put themselves forward from any party. The Gorrie factor is quite substantial. I mean, if you're an MP at Westminster, you've got a seat. If you put yourself forward for a seat for the Scottish Parliament and you don't get it, you're then the candidate who didn't want to be at Westminster and whose party didn't want you in Scotland. A pretty poor fate for the next general election attempt if you have to go forward.
We've seen an awful lot of consensus over the past couple of years about this. Are we now seeing, do you think, some of the activists here saying, well, we're not happy with the way you've been cozying up to Labour on the whole constitutional issue?
We heard that from Ian Smith in his speech, although I think his reference there also was to his own party, the suggestion that Malcolm Bruce made that perhaps the Liberal Democrat policy of a penny on income tax to fund education would have to be deferred. Ian Smith was saying, no thank you, we'll make our mind up in Scotland, thanks very much. And this is an issue in some ways that's come out at this conference, a distinction between those who are remaining at Westminster, remaining in the Westminster powerhouse, and those who believe there'll be an alternative powerhouse in Scotland and want to see the focus shifted there.
Brian, thank you very much. Well, we're actually now moving on to an emergency debate, with the final debate of the conference, and that's about European structural funds. A bit of a mouthful that, but it basically, there are concerns that areas of Scotland like the Highlands will no longer in future get the financial aid that they do at present from the European community. Let's hear a little bit of that debate now.
The present budget of the Union is running at 1.17% of gross national product across the states. It's a pretty small level. Agenda 2000, the work of the civil service or the European Commission, has proposals as to how to handle the future. Frankly, they are tight, and they imply a reduction in support both in agriculture and in structural funding. So where do we go? 90% of the landscape of Scotland is in one way or another supported by the structural funds. The old industrial areas, Lanarkshire and the coalfields in Midlothian and Fife as they were, are supported towards increased opportunities of employment, science and technology research to stimulate further growth. Similarly, in the agricultural areas of southern Scotland and much of the central belt, central area, central southern mid-Scotland, have a similar fund in order to accommodate the changes or the falling in agricultural employment. Here in the north, one half of the landscape for this purpose, Objective 1 status still exists, covering the Highlands and Islands, with very substantial funding, not only for those purposes, but infrastructural and technological development, stimulating growth and improving communications networks. These funds are in threat. The purpose of this motion is to make very clear our concern in conference and to call upon government to stand firm for the interests of the more distant areas in Britain, even if that means advocating some increase in the community's budget. We call upon the government to be resolute in support of the interests of the people of Scotland, and we call upon the agencies which represent government, the Scottish Office, the Department of Trade and Industry, the development agencies both here in the Highlands and Islands and in Scotland as a whole, as well as local authorities, in their separate ways to redouble their efforts to achieve the status quo as far as possible, either directly through the government or through an organisation such as the Committee of the Regions. And above all, since this party represents the major opposition force for Scottish members in the Parliament at Westminster, we ask our Scottish MPs to campaign continuously in support of Scotland's case, however irresolute the government may be. I beg to move.
The motion being moved by John Mellings, and he articulating there the concerns that are being held, particularly in areas like the Highlands here, that if some of the EU funding is lost. Next up to the rostrum, Tavish Scott.
Tavish Scott to speak, and for Councillor Jamie Stone to stand by.
Thank you, Chairman. This debate is timely because it is the start of the process, and I think it is important to remember that it is exactly that, the start of a process. There is much to play for here. We are entering potentially a transitional period, but we have, right at the outset, political support across the spectrum, and I think that is extremely important to use that to the advantage of the Highlands and Islands. But can I say one thing? I don't think the argument should be in terms of maintaining Objective 1 status, or whatever we wish to call it, or whatever it becomes. I don't think the argument should be about poverty. That is not an argument I want to see used to justify continual structural fundings. Our arguments are about sparsity, they're about competitiveness, and they're about the vital improvements to our infrastructure. If I can take two examples in my, as it were, hometown, in Lerwick, a major key development is currently going ahead, where we are dredging, where we are reclaiming land and deepening water to ensure the continued competitiveness of that port, to service the oil industry and to service the larger pelagic fishing fleet that is now around Scottish waters. This project that is currently going on would not have happened without Objective 1. Similarly, we are in the middle of commissioning a waste-to-energy plant which meets a number of criteria, both in terms of managing waste, in terms of Agenda 21, because the project will turn offshore waste and domestic waste into power, which will go into a district heating system, which will provide cheaper power for Lerwick's secondary and primary schools, for its hospital, and for the business community. Similarly, this project would not have happened without Objective 1. The future, to move on from where we are, is about telecommunications links, and that is the piece of the investment particularly that I would like to see effort put into.
Well, that's where we must leave the debate for the time being, and indeed that's all from our coverage of the Scottish Liberal Democrats here at Inverness. From all of us here at the Eden Court Theatre, good afternoon.